MASH is one of the most popular multimedia franchises in America's great storybook. The show starring Alan Alda won 99 Emmys, the Robert Altman movie won an Academy Award, and the novel by Richard Hornberger is a bestseller. It's beyond question that most MASH fans love the TV show best, since it has so much more content and so many more stories to appeal to different demographics of TV goers all over the world. Although the movie has its own cult following, and many die-hard MASH fans make it a pilgrimage to read the original novel at least once. For most of 2 decades, MASH mania caught America by storm, and the franchise exploded into a multiverse, with Hawkeye Pierce and other beloved characters drinking and carousing across multiple mediums, each with its own fascinating timeline for its own universe. Today, we delve into the various timelines of the MASH multiverse. Let's begin with the timeline that started it all, Richard Hornberger's MASH trilogy, which he wrote under the pen name Richard Hooker. Hornberger was a surgeon at the 8055th MASH during the Korean War. In the 1960s, as the anti-war movement grew in America and spread into America's conservative movement, Hornberger wrote a novel loosely based on his own experiences, with much focus on the pranks, drinking, and escapades that army doctors did in order to not go insane from all the stress they were under. So this is the original timeline of the original MASH universe. At the dawn of the Roaring Twenties, in the heyday of Prohibition, the future swamp men are born. Duke is born in Georgia in 1922, and Hawkeye in Maine in 1923, with Trapper and Spearchucker born in New Hampshire and Georgia around the same time. In the late 20s or early 30s, Henry Blake joins the Army. Margaret Houlihan enlists around the same time, and both will eventually end up as officers in the Army Medical Corps. In the late 1930s, presumably 1938, Father John Patrick Mulcahy begins 7 years of missionary service in Bolivia. Although not mentioned in the books, Henry Blake and Margaret Houlihan presumably serve in medical units in World War II. All the future swamp men managed to dodge military service during World War II despite being of age, likely due to draft deferments for being in medical school. During college as an undergrad, Hawkeye plays against Trapper John when Androscoggin College's football team faces off against Dartmouth. Hawkeye also marries his girlfriend Mary in college, and their oldest son is born while Hawkeye is in medical school in the mid-1940s. The Allies win World War II in 1945. The American occupation of Japan begins in late August. Presumably in 1945, Father Mulcahy begins missionary work in China as the Chinese Civil War resumes. Meanwhile, the Korean peninsula is divided for occupation along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south. 3 years later, North and South Korea officially become separate countries. Though not in the narrative, the Communists win the Chinese Civil War in 1949, and Mao declares the People's Republic of China on October 1st. Either in 1949 or 1950, Father Mulcahy leaves China and returns to the U.S. On June 26, 1950, the Korean War begins when the Korean People's Army invades the Republic of Korea. The UN intervenes on South Korea's behalf, while the Soviet Union provides North Korea with logistical support. In October of 1950, the Marines land at Incheon, and UN forces recapture Seoul. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. Army sets up 7 mobile Army surgical hospitals in Korea, including the real 8055th and the fictional 4077th. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake of the regular Army is placed in command of the 4077th. Corporal Radar O'Reilly, who's a volunteer, not a draftee, is company clerk. Father Mulcahy is either drafted or enlists as an Army chaplain between 1950 and 51. Either way, he ends up assigned at the 4077th. Later that month, Mao decides that China will intervene on North Korea's behalf. In December 1950, over 100,000 Chinese troops cross the Sino-Korean border and eventually push the UN forces south of the 38th parallel. Seoul changes hands 2 more times, and in 1951, the fighting will remain along the 38th parallel for the rest of the war. Captain Hawkeye Pierce, a 28-year-old draftee, arrives in Korea in the summer of 1951. He meets Captain Augustus Bedford Forrest in Seoul, a fellow surgeon who also has orders to report to the 4077th. Early in their tour, they grow to dislike their tent mate in the swamp, Major Hobson, specifically disliking his constant prayers which keep getting longer all the time. They succeed in bullying Henry Blake into transferring Hobson to another billet, And after a chain of events involving Hawkeye and Duke getting in trouble and put under guard by MPs, Hobson annoys the whole camp with his public prayers in the dining hall until Henry Blake finally transfers him back to the States. 8 months into Hawkeye and Duke's tour, so in the spring of 1952, Captain John McIntyre begins his tour of duty at the 407 7th and is billeted in the swamp. He keeps to himself for a week until Hawkeye finally figures out that the new surgeon is the Trapper John he knew from college football. Presumably around the same time that Trapper John arrives, Captain Frank Burns also begins his tour at the 407 7th MASH. Hostility quickly develops between Frank Burns and the Swamp Men, who have diametrically opposed worldviews. Late in the summer of 1952, the Swamp Men's butler Ho-John gets drafted into the South Korean Army. 6 weeks later, Private Ho-John is wounded in battle and becomes a patient at the 407 7th. The Swamp Men get him out of the army and raise the money to send him to college in Maine. To find out how they raise the money, you'll have to read the book. Several months into Trapper's tour, presumably the late summer or early fall of 1952, Major Margaret Houlihan arrives at the 407 7th. Her arrival temporarily distracts Frank Burns and the Swamp Men from their rivalry, but after Houlihan quickly sides with Burns against the Swamp Men, the hostility evolves into fights. There is also an incident that leads the Swamp Men to start calling Houlihan by the nickname Hot Lips, which annoys both her and Frank Burns to no end. At the peak of the Swamp Men's feud with Burns, Henry Blake catches Frank Burns assaulting Hawkeye in the supply room, getting Frank Burns sent back to the States. Around the same time period, Hawkeye and Trapper go to Tokyo, where Trapper meets Ezekiel Mile Marston. Hawkeye and Trapper operate on a Korean baby whom Mile will adopt, naming him Ezekiel Bradbury Marston IV. In the fall of 1952, the 407 7th cheats their way to victory in a football game against General Hammond's evac hospital. In the process, Oliver Wendell Jones, aka Spear Chucker, is transferred to the 407 7th at Henry Blake's request and immediately becomes the 4th Swamp Man. According to the timing of when each Swamp Man started his tour of duty, the 4 Swamp Men were actually only together for 2 or 3 months at the most. In the fall of 1952, after 16 months in Korea, the draftees Hawkeye Pierce and Duke Forrest are sent home, leaving behind their friends Trapper John, Spear Chucker, Radar O'Reilly, and Father Mulcahy. Hawkeye and Duke part ways in Chicago O'Hare Airport. This is the end of the original MASH novel, but not the end of their story.